Okay, skeletal tissue, part 3. So, Wolff's Law says a bone grows or remodels in response to the forces or demands placed upon it. This is why at the end of the last unit we talked about how the older you get, the more you need to exercise, because if you're putting stress on your bones, it's going to stimulate that bone to respond. So long bones are thickest midway along the shaft where the stress of bending is the greatest. So you think about all the weight that is put on your femur all day long, running, carrying stuff, walking up and down stairs. A tremendous amount of stress is on it. So the thickest part of the bone is going to occur where most of the point of stress is the greatest. Curved bones are thickest where they are most likely to buckle. Bone fractures are classified by 4 different ways: the position of the bone ends after the fracture, the completeness of the break, the orientation of the bone to the long axis, and whether or not the bone ends penetrate the skin. So we're going to talk about all the different types of bone fractures. A non-displaced is where the bone ends retain their normal position, and that's in the first picture there. Displaced, so the bone ends are out of normal alignment. So you can see in that second picture there how one of them has kind of slipped past the other one. That's a displaced bone fracture. A complete bone break is where the bone breaks all the way through, and you can see that in the first picture. An incomplete is where the bone... Let me just number them there so you can see what I'm talking about. Incomplete is where the bone is not broken all the way through. So you can see there's still a line right here at the edge where the bone didn't break all the way through. And a linear is where the fracture is parallel to the long axis of the bone. A transverse is where the fracture is perpendicular to the long axis. A compound is when the bone ends penetrate the skin. And then a simple is where the bone ends do not penetrate the skin. Comminuted, the bone fragments into either 3 or more pieces. This is common in the elderly because their bones are so fragile. And that's that first one right there. A spiral, the ragged break when bone is excessively twisted, common in sports injuries. And that's that one right there. And the depressed is where the broken bone is pushed inward. And this is typically with blunt force trauma into a brain. And obviously if it were to puncture the brain, you could have serious brain damage and even death. A compression fracture is where the bone is crushed. This is common in porous bones. You see this a lot with spinal injuries. If someone were to fall and their vertebrae is actually crushed and crumpled right there. Epiphyseal break is where the epiphysis separates from the diaphysis, and this usually occurs along the epiphyseal lines where cartilage cells are dying. And then a green stick is an incomplete fracture where one side of the bone breaks and the other side bends, and this is common in children, again because their bones are growing so much, there is weakness associated with them. So to repair a bone fracture, it's initiated by, so you can see when the bone first starts to break, you have a hematoma formation. So all those broken blood vessels start to bleed, and you have bleeding under the surface there start to accumulate. It's initiated by bone death and damage to the blood vessels. That dead bone is then removed by the osteoclast, and then a bony callus is formed. That callus tissue anchors the bone together and will serve as a model that will be replaced by normal bone. So the osteoclasts are continuing to work and remove dead bone, and the osteoblasts are working to lay down new bone tissue. And even at this point, at the number 4, the bone is still weak at this point, and you would still, could possibly still be in a cast at this point to allow it to fully heal and fully strengthen before you continue normal activity. Cartilage is also known as gristle. Permits great weight by acting as a shock absorber. Permits growth in long bones, and consists of hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Different homeostatic imbalances, so these are basically diseases or disorders with the bone. Osteomalacia is where bones are inadequately mineralized, so they haven't become properly calcified, and this is causing the bones to be weak. The main symptom is pain when weight is put on the affected bone, and is usually caused by insufficient calcium in the diet or vitamin D deficiency. Rickets is osteomalacia in children, and it causes bowed legs and deformities of the pelvis, skull, and rib cage, and is caused again by insufficient calcium in the diet or by not enough vitamin D either. Rickets has essentially been eliminated in the U.S. However, in recent decades, the rates have begun to increase again because of the poor diets of most children. Most children are not getting enough vitamin D or calcium and are drinking, sugary drinks instead of milk and things like that. Infants of breastfeeding mothers are deficient in vitamin D and also could be vitamin D deficient and develop rickets. So it's important if a mother is breastfeeding that she supplements her diet with extra vitamin D so that the baby can have some as well. And that the baby also gets a little bit of sunlight each day because the sun stimulates the skin to produce vitamin D. Osteoporosis is a group of bone diseases in which the bone reabsorption is outpacing the bone deposit. So spongy bone of the spine is the most vulnerable, which is why you tend to see elderly people with a hunchback, and occurs most often in postmenopausal women. Bones become so fragile that even sneezing or stepping off a curb can cause the bones to break. So this is when making sure you are properly taking care of yourself is critical. So to treat osteoporosis, calcium and vitamin D supplements and weight-bearing exercises are really, really important. You can also do hormone replacement therapy, which will slow bone loss. And natural progesterone creams help prompt new bone growth, and statins also help increase bone mineral density. Paget's disease is kind of the opposite. This is where you have too much bone formation and not enough bone breakdown. So the bone has an excessively high ratio of woven to compact bone, which is spongy to compact bone, but this causing the bones to be very weak. The osteoclasts, which help break down the bone, aren't active enough, and the osteoblast continues to work. So treatment would involve stimulating those osteoclasts. It's usually localized in the spine, pelvis, femur, and skull. As you can see in this picture here, this x-ray, the parts that are really dark have a whole lot of bone density. The cause is really unknown. It's suspected that it could be viral. Treatments include drugs like ditronate and Fosamax.